a seasonal caretaker at a national park in Alaska. I won't say which one, because I still value my job, and I've been warned by my employers to keep my mouth shut about anything unusual I've seen during my time here. That being said, there are some very strange things that I've seen over the last 3 years that I've held this position, and I figured I'd share some with you. You may not even be aware what a seasonal caretaker is, and that's completely understandable. Generally, it's not that exciting, if I'm being honest. I start my season when the park is closed for the winter, and it's my responsibility to make sure that the various cabins and public buildings are maintained, and that the snow is kept cleared from their roofs to prevent any damage, that sort of thing. It's a lonely job, and if you're a people person, it's probably not for you. It takes a bit of an odd duck to willingly put themselves into exile for 3 months at a time, knowing that there's no way out until the snow begins to melt, and the plows can start clearing some of the access roads that lead you out to my cabin. I do have a snowmobile that I can use to take the 3-hour trip to the nearest ranger station if I need to, but it's not like a quick trip to the corner store. It's just fine for me, though. I've always been a bit of a loner, and I have Max, my Jack Russell Terrier, to keep me company. The job isn't very demanding. I typically only spend a few days each week tending to my responsibilities, and the rest of the time is mine to do with as I please. A few years ago, I took up nature photography as a hobby to pass the time, and have even had a few of my pictures published by an organization you'd recognize by name. I have framed copies of those magazines hanging on the wall behind me right now, as a matter of fact. A lot of people come through this park during the more temperate months. It's probably one of the most popular places for outdoorsy folks to come exploring in this region of Alaska. In the winter months, however, it's completely deserted, except for a few lonely ranger stations and the like. I'll go for weeks at a time without seeing a soul, and the only person I speak with any regularity is my ranger buddy. We'll call him Rick, who I check in with a few times a week on the radio. Aside from that, it's just me and Max. I'm not sure how to best go about telling you about some of the things I've seen up here in the dark, frozen days of winter, so I'll just dive right in and tell you about the shades. At least, that's what I call them when I'm talking to myself. I have no idea what they really are, but when the winter storms are blowing strong against my shuttered cabin windows, and the visibility in the snow and dim light are next to nothing, you'll see them. It's almost like looking at someone moving behind a pane of frosted glass, all indistinct and shadowy. At first, I just thought my mind was playing tricks on me, finding patterns in the chaotic static of all that falling snow. But then I started hearing them as well, like murmurings just loud enough to hear over the howl of the wind, but too quiet to recognize them as any sort of intelligent speech. It's enough to set you on edge, I can tell you that much. They tend to only show up during a heavy snowstorm, and the fiercer the storm, the closer they'll come to the cabin. It's gotten to the point where I'll make sure I've locked my doors and windows long before nightfall if I know there is a storm coming. One time, during an especially nasty blizzard, I could actually hear them moving around my cabin like some sort of nightmare parade. That night was bad. At one point I actually saw and heard the doorknob of my front door turning, all slow and deliberate, accompanied by what sounded like soft scratching at the wooden surface. The worst of it, and I'll swear on a stack of Bibles that it's true, was the faint whispering voice that kept calling my name just on the other side of the door. That went on for an hour or more, and even now, if I close my eyes, I can still hear that cold, hollow voice. It's what I would imagine a person would sound like if their soul were ripped from their body. I suppose I'm being a little overly dramatic, but it's the only way I can describe it. Alive, but also lifeless. I don't know a better way to explain it. No reason to dwell on it, I guess. I will say that I'm not sure what would have happened if I hadn't remembered to throw the deadbolt that night. But I'm not interested in finding out. Just thinking about it makes me anxious. I mentioned it to Rick the next day after the storm had quieted, when I could get a radio signal out. I expected him to laugh at me for letting myself get all spooked by the dark, but he didn't. He very calmly and firmly told me that it was better not to talk about them at all, and to just make sure I kept myself locked up nice and tight when the heavy snowstorms came. I tried to prod him for more information, but he just refused to elaborate any further. The only thing he would add was that not everything sleeps when winter comes on up here. I have to admit, he creeped me out more than a little with that zinger. He definitely knows something about them, and I'm going to try to pin him down one day and get more information. The next thing on the list is the car graveyard. I shit you not, if you explore far enough off the beaten trail out here, chances are pretty good you'll find one. A car or truck just inexplicably deposited in the middle of backwater Alaska. Like that makes any sense at all. The first one I ever saw was an early 2000s BMW coupe, looking like it was just off the showroom floor, except for the fact that half of it was embedded in an old spruce that had probably stood there since before cars even existed. It almost looked like the tree had grown around the car, or maybe the car had been interposed into the tree. I don't know how it's possible. I just know it was there. I've seen a few of them during my time here, sometimes trapped in the trees like the BMW, and sometimes just sitting in the middle of an open space of ground. Every one of them looked like they were fresh off the road, and none of them had any logical way they could have gotten out there, even without the whole stuck in the trees part. The most unnerving thing about the cars, though, is the clothing. I've stopped looking and just tend to avoid going anywhere near one if I see it. But the first time I saw one, my curiosity led me to check it out. I tried to open the doors, but they were all locked. When I looked through the windows, though, I saw the damnedest thing. In the front seat, it looked like someone had laid out clothes. Pants, shirts, socks, shoes, the whole deal, and strapped the seatbelts around them. It was like the people in the car had just vanished in mid-drive, leaving the clothes behind just the way they'd been wearing them. Eerie is one word for it, but if I'm being honest, it scared the shit out of me. The other thing about the cars is that you won't find the same one twice. When I first saw that BMW, I came back out the next day with my camera to take a picture of it, but it wasn't there anymore. I thought I'd simply forgotten where it was, or that I'd gotten turned around. But when I saw my boot prints in the snow from the day before, I knew that I was in the right spot. I tried to report it to the rangers as well, but Rick told me they wouldn't even send anyone out to investigate them anymore. By the time anyone got out there, they'd be gone. Apparently, reports of this sort of thing have been coming in periodically over the last 20 or 30 years, and nobody knows anything about them. He did tell me that one of the rangers had found one once, a school bus from Texas, if you can believe that. In each of the rows of seats were piles of empty clothes, with the exception of the driver. The ranger that found it said that the driver was sort of there, but not really. Almost like a blurry hologram frozen in time. He said that the driver, an elderly man, looked like he was frozen in some terrified scream, all wide-eyed and gaping mouth. The ranger tried to get into the bus using the rear emergency door, but when he got the door open, a loud buzzing sound filled his ears, and a high-frequency vibration ran through his body like an electric shock. He said the closer he got, the more intense the sound and sensation became. Before he could even take a step inside the bus, It grew so strong that he thought he was going to pass out. The best he could describe it was like when you have two strong opposing magnets that you're trying to push together. The more you push, the stronger the resistance becomes. He said it was almost like the universe was somehow keeping him out of the bus, like he didn't belong in it. He stumbled away from it and spent the next day in bed, sicker than a dog. When he came back out a few days later with some other rangers, the bus was gone. I can't really speak for the buzzing and vibrating personally. I just know that I avoid them whenever I see them. They're just not right. The last thing I'll tell you about today is the bridge. About a mile or so away from my cabin, along a maintained footpath, there's a rope bridge that crosses a deep ravine. To the side of it, there's a bit of rock jutting out that's used as a kind of observation point. You know what I mean, where hikers will stop and take selfies along their trek to post to Facebook or Twitter or whatever. The Parks Department even went through the trouble of installing handrails along the edge of it to prevent anyone from falling to their death. Of course, there aren't any hikers here during the winter season. The park is technically closed, and all roads leading into the area are blocked by chains to prevent anyone from driving in and getting into trouble with no possibility of rescue. I hike down that path probably once a week, looking for new photo opportunities to occupy my time. It's a beautiful walk, and the whole landscape seems so crisp and fresh without people tromping all around it. I've gotten some incredible shots of the bridge, but I don't dare step out onto it when it's this cold, though. The boards are constantly frozen and slick with ice. I'm pretty sure it wouldn't take much of a misstep to fall on my ass and slide out from under the waist-high rope handholds. I'd be falling 200 feet to the rocks below before I even realized what was happening. Here's the weird part, though. Invariably, when I reach that bridge, I'll find multiple steps of footprints leading up to the rocky outcropping, but none of them leading away from it. They'll come from all different directions, some from the path and others straight out of the trees, but they all seem to stop at the edge of the ravine. There are various sizes and stride lengths, some of which are very small, and others are so large they have to have been made by some massive hulk of a person. The first time I saw them, I was afraid that some trespassers had gotten too close to the edge and fallen over. But when I spent the better part of a day making my way carefully to the floor of the ravine, I couldn't find any sign that anyone had been there besides me. I'll be the first to admit that I'm no tracker, but even I can tell when footprints in fresh snow lead up to a place and don't return. I've walked out onto that outcropping myself once to see if I could figure out where all these people had gone. Maybe there was a hidden path that I wasn't seeing, but the moment my foot touched that stone, my head began to throb like I was suffering from the worst hangover I'd ever had. When I staggered back from it, the pain disappeared like it had never been there, and I was left with a pretty insistent nosebleed for the rest of the afternoon as my only souvenir. I didn't try again. Max won't even go anywhere near it. He'll start whining as soon as we start approaching that part of the trail. Mind you, this is a dog that I've had to, on multiple occasions, wrestle inside the cabin because he was so incensed that a pack of wolves dared wander too close to his territory. For all of his small stature, he doesn't seem to have the self-preservation gene that tells him when he should be afraid of something. But not the Overlook, though. That's a different story altogether. Even Max has his limits, I guess. I have more stories, but I'm getting a little tired and it's about time for me to get some sleep. Tomorrow, I need to head out to the cabins by the frozen lake and make sure the roofs are clear. I'll write more later. Next time I'll tell you about the dead bears. Hey y'all, it's me again. First of all, wow, I didn't expect this sort of response. Thanks for all the great feedback on my previous post. Honestly, I wasn't sure how interested anyone would be in some of the things going on out here. and I was more than a little surprised when I got back to my cabin yesterday and saw all the responses. Before I get rolling with some more experiences I've had out here, I just wanted to address a few questions or comments that folks have made on my last update. Someone suggested that I should try to capture the shades with my camera. That's a good suggestion, and I've already tried that on a couple of occasions. The issue I've run into is that, because of the darkness and the snow, I only really have two options. Either use a flash or some other light source, or else use a long shutter speed on my cameras. Even though I was pretty sure neither one would work, I have actually tried both methods. Unfortunately, as anyone who has driven in a snowstorm can attest, snow is great at reflecting light, which is why you can't use your high beams when driving in it. The light just reflects off the snow and back into your eyes, effectively blinding you. My results using this method were about what you'd expect. Nothing but a complete whiteout of captured images. Using a slow shutter speed didn't yield any better results. All I got were images of completely incomprehensible motion blurs. I suppose there are probably better camera rigs out there that may be able to overcome these challenges, but I don't know of them. Even if they do exist, they're probably well outside of my budget. The National Park Service doesn't exactly pay seasonal caretakers in gold bullion. There was also a concern that, even though I'm trying to remain anonymous, I've given away enough details about myself that my employers should easily identify me. Don't worry about that. Firstly, there are more than 20 national parks in Alaska, covering over 50 million acres of land. Believe it or not, it actually contains a majority of the national park land in the entire United States. Something like 65% of it. As you can imagine, there are a lot of folks spread across the state doing similar jobs to mine. It's hard to envision exactly how expansive Alaska is and how much of it is covered with stark wilderness unless you've been here and seen it for yourself. I know that I didn't have the faintest clue before I got here from the lower 48. I guess the bottom line is that it's pretty unlikely that anyone from the NPS will be able to identify me from what I've told you about myself. If they do, I guess we'll cross that bridge then. Finally, someone asked about the license plates on some of the vehicles that mysteriously appear out here in the wilderness, and whether they were all from one area or from all over. I previously mentioned that I tend to avoid them if I come across them anymore, but I can tell you that the first car that I ran across, the BMW, had a European-style license plate on the front. I assumed at the time that it was just one of those trendy plates that folks in the US sometimes put on the front of their European cars for decoration, but it's possible that it was legitimately from somewhere in Europe. I'm not sure. I recall that it was white and blue, and beyond that, I don't remember much about it. Of course, the bus that the ranger found had Texas plates on it, but I don't know about any others. Sorry. Okay, so now that I've cleared those points up, let's dive into some of the other things going on out here. Since I mentioned it in my previous post, I'll start off with the bears. So you probably already know this, but Alaska has some of the largest and most dangerous bears in the entire world. Fortunately, the Kodiak and the polar bear aren't generally found inland up here, but we still have more than our fair share of grizzlies and large black bears, both of which are apex predators and will make quick work of the unwary or unprepared. Now, since my contract covers the colder winter months, most of these bears are hibernating during my time here. That being said, not all bears hibernate, especially if they are in an area of plentiful food supply. Also, even when they are hibernating, they'll still become active from time to time, so you definitely can't let your guard down if you want to stay on this side of the grave. It's a pretty safe bet that anyone who works up here especially alone, tends to carry a rifle as well as a large caliber handgun whenever they're outside of their cabin. I'm no exception to that. I carry a 45-70 lever action over my shoulder and a 500 Magnum revolver in a chest holster. At first glance, it may seem like overkill. That is a tremendous amount of firepower after all. However, the first time you catch a glimpse of a mama grizzly with her cubs, and you realize that you're looking at an 800-pound predator that can run you down in a heartbeat, you'll start wondering why I don't carry even more. The reason I mention all this isn't to give you the impression that they're some sort of mythical creatures hiding behind every tree just waiting to pounce, only that they represent the top of the food chain up here. Period. Nothing, and I mean nothing, short of a pack of starving wolves will even threaten one, and even that's only been documented on a handful of occasions. They're massive, powerful, and aggressive. And if you live out in their territory and don't keep your head on a swivel, you're an idiot, and probably soon to be converted into bear shit. So, all that being the case, I'm sure you'll understand what it means when I tell you that something is killing big grizzlies out here. I'm not talking about poachers or indigenous hunters or anything like that. I'm talking about something, as in not humans, and definitely not hungry wolves. But let me back up a step. My first season out here as a winter caretaker was a hell of a learning experience. Just trying to figure out the necessary maintenance routines and learning to navigate around my area of responsibility was a little overwhelming. One day, I was returning from making my rounds out to one of the ranger stations that was shut down for the winter, and ended up taking a wrong turn on the trail. By the time I realized my mistake, I was already a fair distance along the new path and wandering into unfamiliar territory. Just as I was getting ready to turn around and retrace my steps, I topped a rise and was suddenly faced with the unmistakable form of a grizzly, not 30 feet along the path ahead and facing away from me. I've got to tell you, I almost pissed myself as I fumbled to unsling the rifle from my shoulder. It's a damn good thing I didn't actually need it at that moment, because I discovered to my dismay that I had stupidly slung my shoulder pack over top of the rifle sling, effectively trapping it against my body. Stupidity and complacency are what get you killed out here, folks, and I could have been a perfect example of both at that moment. As it turns out, the bear wasn't moving. It was just standing there, perfectly still, its hindquarters facing me, and I knew instinctively that something was wrong with it. Giving up on my rifle, I grabbed my handgun from its holster and cautiously approached the grizzly. My eyes intent on the bear and prepared for the slightest hint of movement. The closer I got to it, though, the more certain I became that it wasn't going to suddenly lunge at me and give me a lesson on exactly where on the food chain I placed. Here's where it gets surreal. Before I got close to it, I had already recognized that it was dead. What I couldn't explain was why it was still standing. It had clearly been there a while, as there were no paw prints leading up to it in the snow, and as I rounded to the front of it, I could see the flesh around its muzzle was already starting to decompose and pull back from its skull. When I got a good look at it, I could also see that it was missing tufts of fur here and there. Despite all that, it was still standing, like it had died and just forgotten to fall down. I looked it over pretty closely, which was an unnerving experience, dead or not, but I couldn't find any sort of wounds or blood that might indicate why it had died. It was then that I realized a couple of things. Firstly, that there were grizzlies in the area that were active, and secondly, nothing had scavenged the carcass. To say this is unusual is an understatement. Most of the top carnivores in this area, including wolves, wolverines, and foxes, supplement their diets by scavenging on carrion. The fact that this bear had died and remained completely intact wasn't just perplexing. It was unnatural. I reported the find to the ranger station and heard back later from Rick that there had been nearly a dozen other similar discoveries within the general area in the last 2 months. The NPS had even brought in some fancy zoological pathologists from Anchorage to figure out what had killed the bears. They spent 2 weeks in the field with the rangers examining the carcasses, and then one morning they were just gone. They had apparently been abruptly recalled without so much as a "by your leave." Immediately after that, the carcasses were destroyed, and the investigation shut down. A week later, a rushed and astonishingly brief report came back indicating death by natural predation. No further investigation indicated. Natural predation. I'm not sure how a predator could have killed the bear I found without leaving a single mark on it or trace of blood, let alone somehow keep it standing upright after death, and then deciding it wasn't even going to feed on the kill. I call bullshit, and so did the rangers. Rick told me his boss had tried to contact the pathologists for more information, but was told that they had all been reassigned and were no longer working with the Park Service. Not one to easily give up, Rick's boss tried calling a private cell number he had gotten from one of the pathologists during their visit. It went to a disconnected message indicating that the phone was no longer in service. This was strange, because he had just spoken to the investigator using that very number only a couple weeks prior, so he knew it was a good number. But late that night, he received a call from an unknown caller. When he answered it, he recognized the hushed voice of the pathologist he had befriended, sounding like they were whispering into their phone. "Leave it alone. Forget about it," was all they said before the line went dead. He tried calling the number back several times, but it just went to dead air each time. That was the last time he heard anything about it. He tried following up with the NPS, but somehow nobody was able to find records that such an investigation had ever existed, or even that any reports of the dead bears had been filed in the first place. Rick told me that, for a while, it was all his boss wanted to talk about. It had become like a splinter in his hand that he couldn't ignore. He called anyone he could think of in the chain of command, at the NPS and any other agencies he thought might be able to provide some clue about what was going on, but couldn't make an inch of headway. Then, one day, he just stopped talking about it, like a switch had been thrown. One evening, Rick and his boss were having beers at a local bar after their shift, and talking about how strange the whole thing was. And then the next morning, his boss walked in, looking a little shaky and out of sorts, went into his office and closed the door, and didn't say 2 words to Rick that day. He never mentioned the incident again. A few times Rick had brought it up in conversation with him later on, and his boss just brushed the whole thing off and changed subjects, looking very uncomfortable about the whole thing. I don't know what happened, but if I had to guess, I'm thinking that his boss was probably digging into something that wasn't meant to be dug into, and someone had convinced him it was better if he just forgot about it. Look, I'm not some conspiracy theorist nutjob, okay? I just know that the whole thing stinks to high hell, and I'll just leave it at that. The other thing I'll tell you about today is what we call the Witch's Lodge. I'm not sure what it was originally. It's really not much more than a single-room log cabin built out in the deep bush. I've seen it a couple of times and been inside once. It's a bit of a hike from my spot and not somewhere easily traveled, even by snowmobile, so I don't get out that way very often. Old abandoned cabins aren't really that unusual up here. You'll trip across them from time to time, although most aren't much more than a few walls and a collapsed roof after the years and harsh Alaskan winters get through with them. The Witch's Lodge is a little different, though. As far as I'm aware, nobody lived there for a long time, but whoever built it must have known what they were doing, because it looks every bit as solid and maintained as my own cabin. I'm not even sure how it got its name, honestly. I just know that's how it was introduced to me for the first time. So, that's how I'm introducing it to you. A couple of years ago, my ranger buddy Rick radioed me up asking if I wouldn't mind joining him in a search for a couple of missing hikers, a father and his 12-year-old son. I'm just a caretaker. I don't normally participate in ranger or search and rescue related activities, but apparently there wasn't anyone else available to accompany him on that day, and he had gotten a lead that the hikers may have been heading out into my section of the park. In S&R efforts, especially during the dark Alaska winters, finding someone quickly is critical if you want to find them alive, so he wanted to follow up on it sooner than later. Of course, I couldn't exactly refuse to help him, especially not when one of them was just a kid. So a couple hours later, I found myself trailing behind him through the knee-deep snow. We moved along a semi-familiar path for a while before he turned left at a fork, and we started making our way along another that I wasn't familiar with. He seemed like he knew where he was headed, like he had a particular destination in mind though, and we really didn't talk much during the hike. We stopped a couple times to rest and sip some hot coffee from our thermoses, but even then, we were both quiet. I think there was some sort of dark cloud hanging over his mood, and I could see it in his narrowed eyes and drawn brow. It was infectious, and soon started manifesting itself in the back of my own mind. An hour later, we came upon the place. I was surprised to see this perfectly preserved little cedar log cabin, just sitting out here among the trees, and looking for all the world like someone would come walking out the front door any moment. Something about the place seemed off, though. Somehow, I knew that nobody lived there, that nobody had lived there in a long time. I can't explain it, but at that moment, I had this strange feeling that we weren't welcome here, like something was telling me to turn around and head back while I still could. Before I had the chance to open my mouth about it, Rick turned to me and pointed towards a closed door, where I could clearly see boot prints at its threshold. "Come on," he said over the wind that had just blown up, and I could see the grim set to his expression before he turned away from me and started making his way towards the door. I noticed that he had drawn his handgun, so I did the same, though I had no idea why. He reached the entryway of the cabin, and he put his hand on the latch. Before he lifted it, he paused and looked back at me with the same dark expression. "We're going to have a look inside," he said. "If there's nothing to be found in there, fine. We'll turn around and head back to your cabin for a couple glasses of whiskey by the fire. Maybe the other groups will find them then." His eyes fixed hard on mine, like he wanted to make sure I was paying damn good attention to him. "But if we find anyone in there other than this idiot hiker and this kid inside, we're not going to look at them, and we're not going to say a single word to them. Understand? Even if they talk to us first." I nodded at him, more confused than anything else, but that wasn't good enough. "I need you to say it, John, to make sure you understand what I'm telling you," he said, and the set of his eyes were so serious and determined that I repeated his instructions back to him without a second thought. When I did, he gave a brief nod and lifted the latch, pushing the door inward. We stepped through the doorway and into the darkened room beyond. As soon as we did, I was overwhelmed by the stench of decay, mixed with the strong sense of herbs and something else, something sickly riding just under the surface of all that. My eyes had started to adjust to the dim light of the interior, and I was able to make out the sparse furnishings of the room. An old rickety table with a solitary, low-backed chair in front of a cold stone fireplace. Along the far wall, I thought I could make out a cot, but I couldn't be sure. "Damn it, it's happening again," Rick said, almost under his breath, and the tone of warning in his voice drew my attention immediately. I turned to find him kneeling next to the desiccated husk of a man's body, dressed in gray snow pants and a red down jacket, slumped back against the wall. It looked like it had been there for years, and I stumbled backwards in shock without realizing it. "What the shit?" I exclaimed, not really knowing what else to say. Rick picked up something that was resting on the floor near the man's skeletal hand, looked around briefly at the room, and then nodded to the door. "Time to go. I'll let the S&R team know that we found the hikers," he said. I was more than a little confused. The body we were looking at was almost mummified. It had clearly been there a long time, and I told him as much, not to mention the fact that there was only one of them. If it was possible that this was the father, that still meant that the son was somewhere out here. "It's too late, John," was all he said, pressing something into my hands as he passed me and stepped out the door. I looked down and realized I was holding a small notebook, like the kind a person might keep in their pocket just in case they needed to write something down. Numbly, I flipped it open. It was mostly empty, except for the first 2 pages, which were scrawled in a sloppy cursive in pencil. I don't have it anymore, so this is going to be as well as I remember it, but it should be close enough that you get the gist of it. "We found her cabin. God, I wish we hadn't. Nathan's gone. She took him. I've been wandering around here for days, but I can't find my way out. I haven't seen Nathan or her since that first day. My boy's gone. How can I not find my way out? What's happening? I can hear her whispers taunting me, but it's always just a little further forward, around the next corner. I don't understand any of this. I'm so sorry." As it turns out, we did end up heading back to my cabin. Rick radioed the S&R team that he'd found the hikers in the lodge, and the person on the other end paused a long moment before replying with a simple acknowledgement. No questions, nothing else, just acknowledged Rick. We didn't say much to each other that night. We just sat in front of my fire and drank the rest of my Jameson until we both passed out. When I returned to consciousness the next morning, Rick had already gotten up and left. We haven't spoken about it since that day. The notebook was gone when I awoke, so I assume he took that with him. Clearly, he knows something about what happened, about that cabin, but I've never asked him about it. I'm not too sure I really want to know. It's hard enough to sleep at night out here sometimes. Speaking of which, I suppose it's time for me to sign off and get some shut-eye. It's already almost 2 a.m., and I've got a long day's work ahead of me tomorrow. It snowed pretty good today, and I was already behind in cleaning the roof of the storage sheds over near the old fire watchtower. I'd rather not have to deal with the damage if the roof collapses, so I'd better get over there as soon as it lets up some outside. I'll write some more soon. Good night, all. I'm back again, but I think this may be my last post. It sounds like I may have attracted the attention of someone I didn't intend to, and after this update, I'm going to lay low and try to disappear. Let me bring you up to speed. First thing this morning, as I was getting suited up and ready to head down to the storage sheds near the old fire watchtower, I heard a knocking on the door to my cabin. Being in the middle of a closed national park in the heart of an Alaskan winter, you can imagine I don't get very many visitors. About the only people I even see out here is my ranger buddy Rick, and the guy who brings me fresh supplies every few weeks. Rick has never just shown up at my door without calling on the radio first, and I know he's had his hands full recently with a few separate incidents of missing hikers, and one self-professed cryptozoologist. So I was surprised to hear his muffled voice calling my name through the locked door. When I opened it and ushered him inside, I saw immediately the concern set to his expression. Without a word, he stepped over to the fireplace and warmed his hands in front of the freshly smoldering log I had just added. "Hell, Rick, you gave me a bit of a start," I told him with a small chuckle, trying to lighten the air a little. Something was up, and I had a sinking feeling that it might have something to do with me. He turned away from the fire and looked at me a long moment in silence before speaking. "I got a call last night, John," he said. His face was creased with a frown. I couldn't tell whether it was one of worry or muted anger, or maybe a combination of both. "Oh yeah?" I replied, trying to keep the tone as casual as I could. He pulled the wool cap off his head and ran his hands over it, smoothing out his short, neatly trimmed hair. "Yeah, and so did a few other rangers apparently." I nodded, and took a sip from my coffee, feeling more uncomfortable by the moment. What about? What do you think? It was about you, he said, pointing at me with his cap. You've attracted someone's attention with your little stories that you've been posting online. My stories? What stories? I said evenly, feigning innocence. I hadn't discussed these posts with Rick since I started updating them. Sure, we've chatted about the possibility of me doing some in the past, but I haven't told him I'd actually written them. As far as he knew, I was just blowing smoke. My palms began to sweat, despite the fact that my cabin's internal temperature was probably somewhere in the low 50s, even with the fire in the hearth. I'd been so sure that there was no way the NPS, or the agency, or anyone else should figure out who's been writing these posts. I didn't even stop to consider they didn't need to figure it out themselves. All they needed to do was start poking around at the rangers in various areas. See, there's no way that anyone who wasn't immediately familiar with this area could have identified it just by the details I've given. I've even made sure to change the names of the places and alter the descriptions of some of the events a little, just to try to make it that much more impossible for anyone to figure out exactly who or where I was. In retrospect, my mistake was obvious. If I was trying to identify the source of these posts, I'd probably go directly to the Rangers, who knew the territory even better than I do. I made the mistake of thinking that my friendship with Rick was strong enough for him to look the other way, to cover my ass. See, the Witch's Lodge isn't really known by that particular name around here. I just made that up as an alias for its real one, but I'm sure that Rick would be able to identify it immediately by reading what I've written about it. The same goes for the other stories too. And I'm also pretty sure that the other Rangers would be able to recognize them for what they really were as well, now that I'm really thinking about it. Shit. I fucked up good this time. Okay, so here's the deal. There are things that happen out here, more than I've told anyone about, more than I was ever planning on alluding to in these posts. Things that they do out here. And things they definitely do not want anyone to know about. I thought I was being so clever by sharing this with you all and disguising the details enough that they couldn't be deciphered and traced back to me. Fuck. Rick tilted his head at me and gave me one of those looks that told me he wasn't in the mood for any games right now. You know the stories I'm talking about, John, he said in a flat tone. The ones that I've told you time and time again were a bad idea. The ones that I told you were going to get you into trouble. I tried to shrug it off, downplay it. Hell, there were just a few stories on the internet, Rick. I was just having a little fun. It gets lonely out here. We go stir crazy sometimes. You know that. Yeah? Well, these little stories have stirred up trouble for us both, he said, setting his hat on the chair and turning away from me, back toward the fireplace. They know who wrote them. They know who you are. I just stood there in shocked silence, mouth hanging open as I stared at my friend's back, sudden comprehension flooding my thoughts. My eyes grew wide. You told them? I asked, stunned. How could I have been so naive? Rick had a job to do. We all had jobs to do out here. We all had people we answered to. We all knew the score. He didn't turn to face me, but I could see his head fall a little in resignation. His face was probably twisted up in frustration at my recklessness, at the position I'd put him in, if I had to guess. I hope there was a little regret there too. I'd like to think that our friendship had been real enough. What did you expect? They'd just look the other way again? This wasn't the first time you've pulled this shit, John, he said, glancing over his shoulder at me. I could see the darkness in his eyes in that brief moment, the resolve that had turned his features to stone, and I knew what was coming. The crackling of the flames from the fireplace almost covered the quiet sound of a fastener being unsnapped, but not quite. He was quick, but I had the advantage. Before I even got the chance to spin around to face me, my magnum was out of its holster and thundering with unimaginable violence in the small confines of my cabin. The air filled with acrid smoke and the afterimage of the muzzle flash glowed in my eyes, superimposed over the dim firelight. Rick staggered to his left, his own handgun falling to the floor as he reached up to clench at the blackened hole in the chest of his jacket, which was now already growing red from the terrible wound beneath. He looked up at me, and I could see the realization in his eyes of what had just happened. He reached out to steady himself against the mantel, gasping for breaths that now had a horrible, wet rattle to them. "I'm sorry, Rick," I said, grabbing my pack from beside the door and slinging my rifle over my shoulder with trembling hands. I screwed it all up. I'm sorry about all of this. He didn't hear me, though. He had slumped to the floor and now stared vacantly at nothing, his blood pooling and spreading from beneath him across the wooden planks. He was gone. That was this morning. I took off out of my cabin as quickly as I could and strapped my pack onto the snowmobile. Within a couple of minutes, I was speeding along the northern trail, away from my cabin in the direction of the decommissioned ranger station. I had killed my friend. He would have killed me if I hadn't acted first. I know. But that doesn't change anything. I've never used my gun to kill anything, man or beast. It was something that was there if I needed it, like a security blanket. But I never really thought I'd have to pull the trigger on anything. Fuck. I've made a mess of this whole thing. I thought it was all over for me when I started a little too close to the edge back in Montana. But Fortunate smiled on me, and the powers that to be decided to give me another chance then. There wouldn't be another pardon for me this time. I'm sitting here in the back room of the old ranger station. I've concealed my snowmobile around back, covered by a tarp and whatever snow I could throw over top. It's starting to snow again outside, so I'm hoping my tracks will be obscured before too long. Maybe it will buy me some time. Just enough time to get some of this out there, to allow me to post some of the truth. I have no delusions about my capabilities. I'm just a caretaker. My training was cursory at best. I'm certainly no match for their teams. My real name, is John Wright. I do actually work for the U.S. government, but not for the National Park Service. At least, not really. I'm not going to name the organization that I work for, not because I'm afraid that they'll find out. It's too late for that now. But because their Raptor AI protocols will identify and censor this entire post before it has a chance to proliferate if I do. Once the post gets out and starts bouncing around to the various servers, it's much more difficult for them to make it go away. My job here is mostly what I've told you. That part's true. But that's mostly just busy work. My cover, if you will. Primarily, I'm responsible for keeping an eye out for trespassers who wander a little too close to their facilities, or things that have escaped from them, or unintended byproducts of whatever the fuck they're doing in there. I don't really know what goes on under the mountain, and I'm sure I wouldn't understand it even if I did. What I do know is that I'm pretty sure those cars that just appeared out of nowhere, hundreds of miles from anywhere they have business being, are from one of those byproducts. The shades? Hell, I don't know. Escapees, maybe? I don't even know what I hope to accomplish by writing all this right now. Maybe it's my way of trying to make it right. Maybe I just want to make sure there's something left of me for anyone to remember. When I was posted here 3 years ago, I saw the entrance to the facility. It's about 10 miles from my cabin, bored directly into the base of a mountain. I have no idea how big it is inside or how many people are in there, but I know there are a lot of big military helicopters flying in and out at the beginning and end of my seasons here. I assume they're transporting researchers or equipment or whatever. It just hit me that if Rick had shown up at my door a half hour earlier, I would have been just finishing my breakfast instead of fully geared up and ready to head out the door for the day. I wouldn't have had my holster strapped to my chest, and I'm certain I'd be the one laying in a pool of my own blood right now. Fuck, concentrate, damn it. I don't have time for this. I don't know what the communication protocol was that Rick was supposed to follow after he took care of me, but I assume someone was waiting for his report to confirm that I'd been silenced. I have to believe that. By now, they know something has gone wrong. There's probably a team at my cabin right now. It hasn't been snowing long enough to cover my tracks, unfortunately, which means they'll probably have no trouble figuring out which direction I took. It's only a matter of time before they show up here. Then, it's all over. Right now, I'm typing this on my notebook computer and relaying it through the ranger station's communication network. I'm surprised they haven't locked down the firewalls yet. I was fully expected to be completely cut off from the world when I got here. Small blessings, I guess. At least I can get this out there still. You've probably gathered by now that most of the rangers around here aren't what they seem either. Some are, I think, but most are ex-military, special forces types, recruited by the agency to provide security and make sure that the caretakers don't go off the reservation like I did. Rick was that way. His real name was Mike, by the way. I won't tell you his last name. I don't want him remembered as anything other than a hero. I'm the one that fucked this whole thing up. He was just doing his job, fulfilling his sworn commitment. He was an honorable man, and that's how I want him remembered. My nerves are starting to get the better of me. I just took a look outside because I thought I heard something. I don't think they can get here this quickly, so I'm thinking it was just my imagination. Look, this isn't something isolated to Alaska. They have research facilities all over the U.S. The last one I was in Montana, but I know there are others spread across the states. Wyoming, Texas, Kentucky, South Dakota. Hell, they're everywhere. They like to build them in national parks, especially those with huge areas of wilderness. It ensures a reasonable amount of privacy, without drawing the sort of attention to it that places like Groom Lake and Cheyenne Mountain have done. Those two places are basically tourist attractions at this point. But man, once they tried out Alaska, it was like they hit the jackpot. The whole area is so remote and uninhabited that they have virtually guaranteed isolation and secrecy to do whatever it is they're doing in there. Did I tell you about the man I found once, half integrated into a boulder? I don't think so. He was wearing a lab coat, but the only parts of him that were accessible were his right arm and his shoulder and the back of his head. The rest of him was somehow inside of it, which was probably for the best. I'm sure he died pretty quickly. I called that one in, and they had a team out there within an hour. I left once they arrived, but when I came back a couple days later, the whole boulder was gone, and the landscape had been made to look like it had never been there. I'm talking about a rock the size of a small house. Just gone. The bear story is true, by the way. The only difference is that it was us who covered the whole thing up. That one scares the shit out of me, because that thing is still roaming out here somewhere. They never were able to find it. Hell, they lost a dozen men just trying. Same story as the bears, by the way. We found the teams down near the runoff gully just standing there, dead. You've never seen a nightmare until you've seen a dozen armed corpses just frozen in place. By the time we found them, they weren't much more than gray skin stretched tight over skeletons. But there they stood, looking like some goddamn zombie army out of a horror movie. I saw it once, I think. The thing that did it. It was about the size of a tall, thin man, but the shape was all wrong. The joints bent in strange ways, and the head was something that reminded me of a praying mantis. It was covered in black and gray mottled skin that looked sort of like scales, but not quite. I don't know. I'm just a caretaker. I came across it while out making my rounds one day. It was clamped onto the back of one of those big grizzlies, arms and legs wrapped around it like it was some sort of monstrous insect or something. The bear was just standing there, making the most god-awful screams you've ever heard, like it was being burned alive or something. But it wasn't moving. It was just standing there, perfectly still, while this thing did whatever it was doing. Feeding on the bear somehow, I guess. I hid behind a tree and nearly pissed myself. I thought for sure it was going to hear my panicked breathing and come for me next, but it didn't. Eventually, the bear stopped making that terrible crying sound and went quiet. A few minutes later, this thing unwrapped itself from around the grizzly, takes a few steps toward a big pine tree, and just vanishes. Only, it didn't really vanish. I nearly stepped out from behind the tree to take a closer look at the bear when I realized that I was still looking at that thing. Only its skin had camouflaged itself perfectly into its background, taking on the exact coloring and pattern of the snow-covered pine. I mean, perfectly. The only reason I was able to see it was because part of it, one of its appendages, I think, was slightly protruding away from the tree. It was this break in the shape of the tree that caught my attention and probably saved my life. I must have stood there for another hour before I finally took a step away from that tree, its surface returning to the black and gray splashes of color. When it moved, it was like a stalking spider, slow and deliberate, graceful and ungainly all at the same time. It was a fucking nightmare, is what it was. It took a few steps closer to the bear, like it was trying to figure out whether it was some new prey or whether it was already used up, like it had forgotten about it and was just looking for its next meal. After that, it glided on down the trail without a sound, thankfully in the opposite direction of my hiding spot. I waited another hour before daring to move an inch, and when I did, I hauled my ass back to my cabin, locked the door, and radioed the whole thing into Mike. They sent a team out, but never found anything other than the bear, which they very quickly made disappear. While I'm sharing my sins, by the way, the real rangers, the ones that originally found the dead bears and reported it to the NPS, well, you won't find them anymore. There were 3 of them that worked with the researchers, just like I said in my story. But a week after the researchers left, all 3 of those rangers somehow wandered off a trail during a snowstorm and died of hypothermia. Yeah, right. Hypothermia. You'd think that the agency could at least use a little imagination when they came up with these stories. I know this whole thing took a sudden sharp right turn on you guys, and I'm sorry about that. I'm out of time though. No more time for pretexts or lies. The bottom line is, you're better off staying out of these parks. Go see a movie. Go for a drive, play video games, whatever. I suppose even state parks are probably safe enough, but I wouldn't chance it. The shit I've seen, what they've done. Okay, I'm pretty sure that wasn't my imagination that time. Time to upload the post. If I'm mistaken and I have more time, I'll just send an update, but I want to make sure this gets out there before they stop it. John Wright, former seasonal caretaker at an Alaskan national park.